I've had to rethink how to frame this review at least half a dozen times now because this is my first time reviewing a foldable phone. I spent a little bit of time last year with the original Galaxy Fold as well as with the Galaxy Z Flip and the Motorola Razr, but only for a day or two at a time, which is never enough to really figure out when a folding screen is and isn't more useful than a more traditional phone. But I've had this phone for about 10 days now, and it's time to stop overthinking things and just get into the review, so let's do just that. I'm Hayato with Android Central, and this is possibly the strangest, most exciting, and futuristic device I've ever reviewed. This is the Galaxy Z Fold 2. If there's any one word I can use to describe this phone, it's refined. Samsung addressed virtually every critical flaw with the original Galaxy Fold, and the result is something that's equal parts experimental, niche, and even practical. Let's start with the hardware, and more specifically the cover screen, because I think that's really one of the Z Fold 2's most significant areas of improvement. Those giant bezels from the first Fold are gone. This is basically an edge-to-edge panel, and it's so much more useful, it's not even funny. The tall, narrow aspect ratio is still a little cramped to comfortably type on, but in nearly every other way, you can treat this like you would any other phone. It doesn't have to just be a notification screen anymore. That narrowness also makes the cover screen a little easier to use one-handed, especially considering how thick the phone is when it's shut. Of course, it gets a lot thinner once you open it up, but before we talk about that main display hidden inside, let's go over the hinge. See, this latch on my tripod is called a cam lock, and it can hold its position pretty well at basically any angle I leave it at. Samsung put 8 of these into the hinge on the Z Fold 2, and the end result is the same. You can leave the screen open at various angles instead of just choosing between open and shut. It feels way sturdier than the previous Fold, and it allows for some interesting new features that we'll talk about in just a minute. We actually saw this first on the Galaxy Z Flip earlier this year, where we also saw the new sweeper tech tucked into the hinge that keeps dust and debris from getting inside and ruining your phone. In fact, even the improvements to the inner display are largely thanks to the Flip. Last year's Fold had a plastic screen that a lot of people, including myself, just weren't too keen on. The Z Fold 2 still uses plastic for the protective outer layer of the display, but underneath is Samsung's UTG or ultra-thin glass, which should hold up better over time than plastic. Samsung also ditched the original Fold's giant notch in favor of this tiny little camera cutout and bumped the entire inner display up to 120 Hz. Actually, it's a variable refresh rate, just like on the Galaxy Note 20 Ultra, and it can dip down to as low as 11 Hz when your screen isn't changing to save on battery life. Along with all of that, this is also just a great display. It's Samsung's dynamic AMOLED 2X, which is super bright and colorful, and at 7.6 inches measured diagonally, this really is a tiny tablet that can fit in your pocket. Yes, there is still a crease. I'm just not sure how we're gonna get around that. You can still see it when you look at the phone off axis, and you can definitely feel it, but it really does almost completely disappear when you're looking at the phone dead on. There's also a battery tucked into each half of the phone, totaling out to a combined 4,500 milliamps, which I've found gets me about 7 hours of screen on time between charges. That's more than enough to get me through a full day, but you can run it down quicker with a heavy enough workload. The 25-watt wired charging is fine, and so is the 11-watt wireless charging, but Huawei can push 40 watts to the P40 Pro, so why can't Samsung with the Z Fold 2? Anyway, let's talk about all the ways you can use the Fold's inner display. You can, of course, run single apps at a time, and most of them scale to either screen without a problem, with the exception of Instagram and Adobe Lightroom, 2 apps that I use every single day. But the Fold is really at its best when you're running 2 apps side by side, or even 3 apps side by side. If you want to get really crazy, you can open even more apps as floating windows with adjustable transparency, but that's a little much for me. I love running 2 apps in split screen view though. Samsung's One UI 2.5 software has great split screen management. You can resize your apps, swap their positions, or jump from a horizontal split to a vertical one. And you can even save your app pairs to the edge screen interface to reopen certain split screen views later. There's also flex mode, which can detect when you start to fold the screen and automatically moves some of the UI elements around in supported apps to make more sense for a split screen view. It works pretty well in the camera viewfinder and apps like Duo or YouTube, but there's not much else that's optimized for flex mode. It's going to be up to Samsung and partially Google to convince developers to make their apps work with Flex Mode, and well, good luck. But I really do hope they do, because Flex Mode goes a long way to making the foldable experience feel more special and intentional, and I really want to see this gain more traction. So one of the areas I find the Z Fold 2's form factor most useful is the camera experience. For one, having a giant screen with a giant viewfinder is really great, even if it does make you look like that guy that's taking photos with their tablet, because you kind of are. But I especially love how Samsung's making thoughtful use of the cover screen here. You can tap a button in the corner of the main screen to show your camera's viewfinder on the cover screen, which is neat for giving your photo subject a preview of the shot, but you can also tap the same button with the camera open on the cover screen to take a selfie with the main cameras, which are much better than the front-facing camera on either display. You get a trio of 12 megapixel cameras on the back in the usual combo of wide, ultra-wide, and telephoto lenses, and while they're not quite as good as the cameras on the Note 20 Ultra, they're still pretty impressive. Colors are punchy and warm, shots are generally sharp with a fair amount of depth, and while I don't particularly love Samsung's aggressive HDR effect, that's just a part of their look that you either love or hate, and a lot of people fall into the former camp. Now, the telephoto camera is only 2x natively, so while you can push it to 10x with digital zoom, you're not going to get the S20 Ultra's crazy 100x, and you also won't get 8K video on here. But most people don't really need those features anyway, I certainly don't, and I think that's a pretty fair compromise given everything else this phone can do. But let's wrap things up by talking about the price. The Galaxy Z Fold 2 costs a penny shy of $2,000 US, which is so much money for most people to spend on a smartphone, especially right now when we're in the middle of a global pandemic and the US is facing an 8.4% unemployment rate. But the Z Fold 2 isn't meant for most people. It's a luxury device with luxury perks like exclusive club memberships and Michelin-prepped meals delivered to your door as part of the Z Premier concierge service that comes with every device. That kind of sounds like nonsense to me, and I would have far preferred for Samsung to just lower the price of the phone instead. But Z Premier is Samsung's way of making Fold owners feel special, like they're being rewarded for buying into the foldable experience, because ultimately the Z Fold 2 is meant for people that, like Samsung, can afford to take financial risks and buy into experimental tech that might not make it to this time next year. I really hope Samsung sticks with this though, because they've gotten incredibly good at foldables in just a year's time, and as more people start to buy into this sort of thing, we'll hopefully start seeing wider app support and maybe even lower prices. In the meantime, it's hard to recommend anyone spend $2,000 on a smartphone, but if you can justify the cost, I think very few phones will take you as far for your money as the Z Fold 2. If you enjoyed this video, you can help us out by giving it a like and subscribing to the channel. And if you're interested in other folding tech, you should check out Daniel Bader's review of the Surface Duo. As always, thanks for watching, and if you can't stay inside, then at least stay safe and wear a mask while you stay mobile. I'm just kidding, but you should totally go watch his review too. We'll see you next time.